In the summer of 1274, a tall, hard-faced man knelt in Westminster Abbey and was crowned King of England. He was 35 years old. He had already survived a brutal civil war, a long crusade across the sea, and an assassin who came at him with a poisoned blade. None of it had killed him. None of it had softened him. Over the next 33 years, this man would conquer Wales and erase its independence forever. He would invade Scotland again and again, earning a nickname carved in cold Latin onto his tomb, the Hammer of the Scots. He would expel an entire community from his kingdom with a single decree. And he would rewrite English law so completely that lawyers 4 centuries later still called him the English Justinian. His name was Edward I. To the people who knew him, he was Longshanks, the man with the long legs. This is the story of how he became the most feared king England had seen in generations, and why, for all his power, the one prize he wanted most slipped through his fingers in the end. Edward ruled England from 1272 to 1307, more than 3 decades. He was a gifted soldier, a relentless lawmaker, and almost impossible to oppose for long. But he did not begin from a position of strength. To understand the king, we have to begin with the boy, born into a kingdom that was coming apart at the seams around his own father. Over the next hour and a half, we will follow Edward through the rebellion that taught him how to fight, the crusade that nearly ended him, the laws that reshaped his country, and the 2 nations he spent his life trying to swallow whole. Let us start at the very beginning, before there was any thought of a crown on his head. A kingdom in trouble. Edward was born at the Palace of Westminster on the night of the 17th of June, 1239. His father was King Henry III. His mother was Eleanor of Provence. He was the eldest son, the heir, and from his first breath he carried the expectation of the throne. His father gave him an unusual name, and the choice tells you a great deal about Henry. Edward was not a fashionable name among the Norman and French-speaking nobility who had ruled England since the conquest 2 centuries earlier. It was an Old English name, an Anglo-Saxon name. Henry chose it deliberately, in honor of Edward the Confessor, the saintly king who had died just before the Norman conquest. Henry was devoted to the Confessor above all other saints. He poured a fortune into rebuilding Westminster Abbey as a magnificent shrine to him. By naming his heir Edward, Henry was reaching back past the conquest, claiming a deeper and more sacred English past for his foreign dynasty. But the kingdom this boy would inherit was unstable, and the source of the instability was his own father. Henry III was a cultured and deeply pious man. He was a great patron of art and architecture, and the Westminster Abbey we know today is largely his creation. As a ruler, though, he was weak and easily led. He surrounded himself with foreign favorites, especially his wife's relatives from Savoy and his own half-brothers from France, and he showered them with lands and offices that English nobles felt belonged to them. Worse, Henry was hopeless with money and with grand schemes. The most notorious was the so-called Sicilian business. The Pope offered the crown of Sicily to one of Henry's younger sons, and Henry leapt at the prize, promising to pay enormous sums to fund a war in Italy that he had no real ability to win. The scheme collapsed, but the debts remained, and to pay them, Henry squeezed his barons harder and harder while ignoring their grievances. By the time Edward reached his teens, the most powerful men in England were seething. They felt shut out of power, drained of money, and ruled by outsiders. The resentment was building towards something dangerous. Edward grew up inside this tension, watching his father lose the respect of the men who were supposed to serve and obey him. It was a lesson he absorbed deeply, and it shaped everything he later did as king. A ruler who could not command his nobles was a ruler who could lose everything, including his crown, the young lord and his Spanish bride. In 1254, when Edward was just 15 years old, his father arranged a marriage that would shape the rest of his life. The bride was Eleanor of Castile, the half-sister of King Alfonso X of Castile, one of the most powerful kingdoms in Spain. The marriage was meant to settle a brewing dispute. The Castilian king had a claim on Gascony, the rich wine-producing duchy in southwestern France that the English crown had held for generations, and a marriage alliance would make that claim go away. The two were married at the monastery of Las Huelgas, near the city of Burgos in Spain, in the autumn of 1254. Edward was a teenager. Eleanor was younger still. By the cold standards of royal politics, it should have been nothing more than a useful arrangement between dynasties. Instead, it became one of the closest royal marriages of the entire Middle Ages. Eleanor would travel with Edward almost everywhere he went, across England, deep into Wales, and even across the sea on crusade. Over their long life together, she bore him around 16 children. The bond between them was genuine, and it would matter enormously near the end of her life. To mark his coming of age, Henry granted his son a vast block of lands and titles all at once. Edward received the Duchy of Gascony, the Lordship of Ireland, the Earldom of Chester, the King's lands in Wales, and a string of castles, along with islands and territories scattered across the realm. On paper, the 15-year-old was now one of the greatest lords in Western Europe. In practice, his father kept a firm grip on the money and the real authority. Edward held grand titles but was often short of funds and short of freedom, dependent on a father he was learning not to respect. Edward also got his first real taste of governing, and it was a difficult one. Soon after his marriage, he spent time in Gascony, the wealthy but turbulent French duchy that was now his to rule. Gascony was a hard apprenticeship. Its towns were proud and quarrelsome. Its lords were used to playing the English and French crowns against each other, and one powerful local nobleman in particular led the region in stubborn revolt against the young duke's authority. Edward struggled at first, short of money and experience, but the long wrestling match with Gascony's unruly lords taught him patience, administration, and the hard arithmetic of holding distant territory. The duchy would remain a thorn in his side for the rest of his life, the cause of an expensive war with France decades later. But it was here, as a teenager, that he first learned the craft of rule. These were also the years in which Edward's character took shape, and the early reports are not entirely flattering. Chroniclers describe him as restless, headstrong, and at times genuinely cruel, a young man with a fierce temper and a love of tournaments and violence. There is a notorious story that a band of his followers, perhaps with his knowledge, mutilated a young man they encountered on the road for no good reason. Whether or not every such tale is accurate, the pattern is clear. The young Edward was dangerous, undisciplined, and not yet the master of himself. He spent much of his time in the company of the Marcher lords, the tough barons who held the violent borderlands between England and Wales, and who lived by the sword. From them, he learned how power actually worked on a hard frontier. He would need every scrap of that rough education very soon, because the long quarrel between his father and the barons was about to erupt into open war, and Edward would be forced to choose a side: Simon de Montfort and the Barons' War. The man at the center of the coming storm was Simon de Montfort, the Earl of Leicester. He was, ironically, a Frenchman by birth, and he was Edward's own uncle by marriage, having wed Edward's aunt. He was also brilliant, intensely principled, and absolutely unbending. By the late 1250s, de Montfort had emerged as the leader of the reform movement, the barons who were determined to force Henry III to share power and to drive out his foreign favorites. In 1258, the barons confronted the king at Oxford and forced him to accept a sweeping program of reform known as the Provisions of Oxford. These handed real control of government to a council of 15 nobles who would oversee the king's decisions. A further set of reforms, the Provisions of Westminster, addressed the grievances of lesser landholders too. Taken together, This was a stunning limitation on royal power. For several years, England was effectively governed by a committee of barons rather than by the king himself. It was, in a sense, an early experiment in constitutional monarchy, forced on an unwilling crown at the point of rebellion. Young Edward's loyalties wavered at first, and this is one of the more revealing episodes of his early life. For a time, he actually sympathized with the reformers, and he even formed an alliance with de Montfort and swore to uphold the provisions. But his deeper instinct and his blood pulled him back toward the crown. As the dispute slid toward civil war, Edward abandoned the reformers and stood firmly with his father. Both sides eventually agreed to let the King of France, the saintly Louis IX, arbitrate the dispute. In 1264, Louis issued his judgment, known as the Mise of Amiens, and he came down completely on the side of King Henry, declaring the provisions of Oxford null and void. It was a total victory for the crown on paper, but it satisfied nobody among the reformers, and it made war certain. If the barons could not win their reforms through agreement, they would have to fight for them. The first great clash came at the Battle of Lewes, in the south of England, in the spring of 1264. Edward commanded the cavalry on the royal right wing, and he charged with terrifying force, shattering the enemy directly in front of him. But then he made the mistake that would define his youth. He chased the fleeing men far off the field, drunk on the pursuit, hungry for the kill, while the real battle raged on behind him. By the time he returned, Simon de Montfort had crushed the rest of the royal army. The day was lost. Edward and his father were both taken prisoner. Simon de Montfort was now the effective ruler of England, governing in the name of a captured king. For Edward, held as a hostage to his father's defeat, it was the lowest point of his life. But it taught him the single most important lesson of his entire career, a lesson he never forgot. Discipline beats fury. A commander who loses control of himself on the battlefield loses control of the battle. He would not make that mistake a second time. Evesham and the making of a soldier. Edward was held under guard, but his captivity did not last long. In the spring of 1265, he escaped, and the manner of the escape became famous. The story goes that he was allowed to ride out and exercise horses under the watch of his guards, and that he asked to test one mount after another, racing each in turn until every guard's horse was blown and exhausted. Then he simply spurred a fresh horse that had been left ready for him, and rode clean away before anyone could catch him. Whether or not every detail is true, the escape itself was real, and it transformed the war overnight. Free once more, Edward gathered the scattered royalist forces and began to hunt Simon de Montfort across the west of England. The reckless boy of Lewes was gone. In his place was a careful, patient commander. Edward moved deliberately, cut de Montfort off from his son's relieving army, seized a vital river crossing, and trapped the old earl near the town of Evesham, hemmed in by a loop of the river with no way out. The Battle of Evesham, fought in August 1265, was less a battle than an execution. Edward's army caught de Montfort with a much smaller force and surrounded him on rising ground beneath a darkening, stormy sky. There was no escape and little mercy. Simon de Montfort was killed, and his body was savagely mutilated by the victors, who hacked off his limbs and head and sent the pieces around the country as trophies. The reform movement died with him on that field. Royal authority was restored, and it was now obvious to everyone that the real power in England was not the broken old king, but his formidable son. Mopping up the last resistance took time. A large group of rebels, stripped of their lands and known as the Disinherited, held out in the great fortress of Kenilworth Castle, which endured one of the longest sieges in English medieval history before finally surrendering. To end the bitterness, a settlement called the Dictum of Kenilworth allowed the rebels to buy back their confiscated lands rather than lose them forever. It was a shrewd, calming measure, and by the end of the 1260s, England was at peace. The crown was secure, and the wounds of the war were slowly healing. Edward had proven himself a soldier of the first rank and a leader of real political judgment. He was still not king. His father lived on, tired and aging. But there was no longer any doubt about who truly ruled England. With the kingdom finally quiet, Edward's restless ambition turned outward, toward the greatest Christian adventure of the age: crusade, assassination, and a crown in absentia. In 1270, Edward took the cross and set out for the Holy Land, joining the crusade being led by the King of France, Louis IX. Eleanor went with him, as she nearly always did. It would prove to be a long, costly, and ultimately fruitless venture, the last serious English crusade to the east. The expedition began with a detour that ended in disaster, though not for Edward. King Louis had decided to attack the city of Tunis in North Africa first, and it was there, in the Crusader camp, that disease swept through the army. Louis IX himself died of it, and the French crusade collapsed into retreat. Edward, arriving to find the great enterprise already falling apart, refused to turn back. He pressed on by sea to the city of Acre, one of the last Christian strongholds clinging to the coast of the Holy Land. What he found at Acre was a weak, divided, and dwindling Christian presence, hopelessly outmatched by the powerful Muslim forces around them. Edward did what he could. He led raids into the surrounding country and won a few small successes, and he helped negotiate a truce to buy the city some time. But he simply did not have the men to change the course of the war. The age of the Grand Crusades was ending, and one English prince, however brave, could not revive it. Then came the moment that nearly ended his life. In 1272, an assassin gained entry to Edward's private chamber, posing as a messenger. The man drew a dagger, said to be coated in poison, and struck. Edward fought him off and killed him with his own hands, but not before taking a deep wound to the arm. The injury festered, the flesh around it began to blacken, and for a dangerous period his life hung in the balance. In the end, a surgeon cut away the poisoned, rotting flesh, and Edward slowly recovered. Fun fact: a famous legend grew up around this attack. It claimed that Eleanor of Castile saved her husband by putting her own mouth to the wound and sucking out the poison. It is a tender, dramatic image, and it has been retold for centuries. Most historians think it is almost certainly a later romantic invention, dreamed up to celebrate the couple's devotion. The grim reality was a surgeon's blade, not a wife's kiss. But the very fact that the story took hold tells you how their marriage was remembered, as a true love match in an age of cold dynastic arrangements. The crusade achieved almost nothing in military terms, and the Christian foothold in the Holy Land would be gone within 2 decades. But it did something important for Edward personally. It gave him the prestige of a genuine crusader, a king who had fought for the faith in the East, and that reputation followed him for the rest of his life and lent a sense of holy purpose to everything he later did. He never stopped thinking of himself as a soldier of God, and he never entirely abandoned the dream of returning to the East, though he never managed it. While Edward was still recovering and beginning his slow journey home, news reached him that changed his title forever. On the 16th of November, 1272, his father, Henry III, had died after a reign of more than half a century. Edward was now King of England, and yet he was thousands of miles away, in no fit state to hurry back. What happened next was, in its own quiet way, remarkable. The kingdom did not erupt. The barons gathered and swore loyalty to their absent king, and the royal government simply carried on in his name under the steady hand of Edward's trusted officials. Compare that to the chaos and rebellion of his own youth, and you can measure how far England had come. The realm held together peacefully, for years, waiting for a king who was not even in the country. Edward, for his part, was in no rush. He traveled home slowly and deliberately, passing through Italy and France, settling disputes and receiving homage along the way. In particular, he stopped to do homage to the King of France for the lands he held there, including Gascony, formally acknowledging the French king as his overlord for those territories. That tangled relationship, in which the King of England was also a vassal of the King of France, would cause him serious trouble later. He did not finally reach England until the summer of 1274. On the 19th of August that year, Edward and Eleanor were crowned together in Westminster Abbey, in a lavish ceremony, followed by an enormous feast. The hardened, scarred soldier was now, at last and in full, the king, the English Justinian. Edward did not spend his reign chasing glory alone. From the very start, he threw his formidable energy into something far less glamorous than war, but ultimately just as lasting. He set out to repair English law and English government, root and branch, and in doing so he changed the country permanently. The England that Edward inherited had a tangled and often corrupt system of justice. Local officials abused their authority and lined their own pockets. Powerful men had quietly seized rights, lands, and privileges that they had no real legal claim to, taking advantage of the weak years of Henry's reign. Royal authority had leaked away in 100 directions. Edward attacked all of this with a torrent of great statutes, broad new laws that reorganized entire areas of English life and that still bear reading today. His first major measure, the Statute of Westminster of 1275, was a sweeping reform of dozens of points of law at once, covering everything from criminal procedure to the rights of the church to the conduct of elections to Parliament. He followed it with many more. The Statute of Gloucester launched a famous and aggressive inquiry, often called quo warranto, which is Latin for by what warrant. Royal commissioners fanned out across the country and demanded that local lords prove by what right they held their privileges and their private courts. If a man could not produce a proper royal grant, the crown clawed the right back. There is a celebrated story of one earl who, challenged to show his warrant, drew an old rusty sword and declared that his ancestors had won their lands with this, and he would defend them with this. The story captures the resentment Edward's inquiries stirred up among the nobility, who saw exactly what he was doing. He was systematically dragging power back to the center, back to the crown. The statutes kept coming throughout his reign. The Statute of Mortmain restricted the flood of land passing into the hands of the church, where it would escape royal taxes and feudal duties forever. The Second Statute of Westminster reshaped the law of inherited estates, keeping land locked within families. The statute, known as quia emptors, reorganized the way land could be bought and sold, simplifying the long feudal chain of lords and tenants. Each of these was a careful, deliberate piece of legal engineering, and together they formed the most important body of legislation England had seen since the Norman conquest. Edward did not work alone. Much of this great legal machine was driven by his brilliant chancellor, Robert Burnell, the Bishop of Bath and Wells, a tireless administrator who served the king faithfully for years, and who supplied much of the steady organizing genius behind the reforms. When Burnell died in 1292, Edward lost one of the most valuable servants of his reign. It was for this whole body of work that a famous lawyer, 400 years after Edward's death, gave him his proudest title. The 17th century judge Edward Coke called him the English Justinian, comparing him to the Roman emperor who had gathered the sprawling mass of Roman law into a single ordered code. Now, strictly speaking, Edward did not codify English law the way Justinian had. But the comparison stuck, and it stuck for a reason. The sheer scale, ambition, and permanence of his legal reforms were undeniable. A great deal of what he built became the bedrock of English common law for centuries to come, and some of it remained formally on the books into modern times. Edward also overhauled the kingdom's money. In 1279, he carried out a sweeping recoinage, calling in the old, worn, and clipped coins of the realm, and replacing them with fresh, reliable silver pennies, along with new smaller coins to make everyday trade easier. Sound coinage meant a healthier economy and, not coincidentally, a richer crown. Edward also reached into the daily lives of ordinary people in a way few earlier kings had managed. He revived and tightened the system of traveling royal justices, panels of judges who rode out on circuits across the country to hear cases, root out corruption among local officials, and bring the king's law to every corner of the realm. He launched great inquiries into how the kingdom was actually being run at the local level, gathering vast quantities of information about who held what and who had abused their position. To a small landholder cheated by a crooked sheriff, or a village ground down by a grasping local lord, the arrival of the king's justices could mean that, for once, there was a higher authority to appeal to. This was royal power reaching down past the great barons and into the ordinary business of the country, and it bound the crown more tightly to the realm than ever before. Not everyone welcomed it. The inquiries were intrusive and the new courts were demanding, but the overall effect was to make the king's justice a real and felt presence in the lives of his subjects, and he transformed how the king made decisions and raised money by developing parliament. Edward summoned these great assemblies frequently, and in 1295 he called an especially broad one, bringing together not only the great barons and bishops, but also knights from the shires, representatives from the towns, and the lesser clergy. Later generations named it the Model Parliament because it resembled a blueprint for what Parliament would eventually become. We should be clear about why Edward did this. He was not trying to share his power with his subjects. He was trying to strengthen it, because a king who could secure the consent of the realm could tax it far more heavily and far more smoothly. But the long-term consequence outran his intentions entirely. By the end of his reign, Parliament had quietly become a permanent fixture of English political life, and it would only grow more powerful from there. The First Welsh War. Now we come to the conquest that defined the first half of Edward's reign as king. To understand it, you first have to understand what Wales actually was in the 13th century. It was not a single country with one ruler and one law. It was a patchwork of small native principalities, mountainous, proud, and fiercely independent, protected by some of the hardest terrain in Britain. Along its eastern edge lived the Marcher Lords, the English barons of the borderlands, who held their territories by the sword and skirmished with the Welsh almost constantly. In the north, in the rugged mountain stronghold of Gwynedd, one man had risen far above all his rivals. His name was Llewellyn ap Gruffydd, and he had achieved something rare and impressive. Through war and shrewd politics, he had brought much of native Wales under his own authority and had won formal recognition as the Prince of Wales. Under the Treaty of Montgomery, agreed during the troubled final years of Henry III, even the English crown had acknowledged his title and his conquests. For a time, Llywelyn was the most powerful Welsh ruler in living memory, the closest thing Wales had ever had to a single national prince. But Llywelyn badly misjudged the new king. There was already bad blood between them, sharpened by the fact that Llywelyn had betrothed himself to Eleanor de Montfort, the daughter of Edward's dead enemy Simon de Montfort, a marriage Edward viewed as a deliberate provocation. When Edward became king and summoned Llywelyn to come and do homage, to formally acknowledge the English king as his overlord, Llywelyn refused. He stayed away from Edward's coronation. He ignored repeated summons, 5 times in all. He insisted that the rights of his principality stood entirely apart from the rights of England, and that he owed Edward nothing. To a king who had spent his whole life learning that a ruler must master everyone beneath him, this open defiance was simply intolerable. It is worth understanding why no English king before Edward had ever managed to conquer Wales outright, despite 2 centuries of trying since the Norman conquest. The land itself was the Welsh people's greatest ally. The mountains of Snowdonia formed a natural fortress, a maze of high peaks, narrow valleys, and dense woodland, where heavy English cavalry was almost useless, and where small bands of lightly armed Welshmen could strike and vanish. Invaders could march in during the summer and burn villages, but when autumn came and supplies ran short, they were forced to withdraw, and the Welsh simply melted back out of the hills behind them. The Welsh way of war suited this country perfectly. They avoided pitched battles, harassed their enemies, and waited for the weather and hunger to do their work. Generations of English armies had blundered into these mountains and come out again with nothing to show for it. Edward's achievement was to grasp that Wales could not be beaten by a single dramatic campaign. It had to be ground down, surrounded, cut off from its food, and then held with permanent stone garrisons. He treated the conquest not as a war to be won, but as a problem to be engineered. And that patience was exactly what had defeated every king before him. In 1277, Edward struck, and the campaign showed exactly the kind of commander he had become. This was no wild border raid. It was a methodical, overwhelming invasion, planned like a great engineering project. Edward gathered a huge, well-paid army and a fleet, and marched into North Wales behind a moving screen of newly raised castles. He sent gangs of woodcutters ahead to hack broad roads through the dense forests so his army could not be ambushed. He used his ships to seize the island of Anglesey, the flat and fertile breadbasket that grew the grain, feeding Llywelyn's mountain heartland. With his food supply cut off and English forces closing in from every side, Llywelyn was starved into submission without a single great battle. The Treaty of Aberconwy ended the First War on Edward's terms. Llywelyn was allowed to keep his life and the bare title of Prince of Wales, but he lost almost all of his power and the great majority of his territory. He was reduced to a shrunken remnant of Gwynedd and forced to bow to Edward as his lord. It was a deep humiliation, but it was not the end of Wales, and it was not the end of Llywelyn. The peace that followed was tense, resentful, and brittle, and within 5 years it would shatter into a far more terrible war. The fall of Llywelyn. The Second Welsh War did not begin with Llywelyn at all. It began with his younger brother, Dafydd ap Gruffydd, a restless and bitter man who had actually fought on the English side in the First War, hoping to be rewarded with lands and power. When Edward failed to give him what he believed he deserved, Dafydd's resentment curdled into rebellion. In the spring of 1282, he launched a surprise night attack on an English castle, and the revolt caught fire and spread across Wales with astonishing speed. Llywelyn, perhaps reluctantly, perhaps seeing no other choice, joined his brother. This was no longer a quarrel about homage and ceremony. It had become a war for the survival of Welsh independence itself. Edward's response was immediate, enormous, and merciless. He understood at once that this was different from 1277. He poured men, money, and supplies into Wales on a scale the country had never witnessed, calling up the full strength of his kingdom. This time he did not intend to negotiate another treaty and leave a defeated prince on his throne. This time he intended to finish Wales for good. The decisive moment arrived in December 1282. Llywelyn had moved south, away from his mountain stronghold in Gwynedd, perhaps trying to raise fresh support in the middle of the country. Near the town of Builth, at a place called Silmary, he was caught and killed, cut off from the bulk of his army in a confused encounter. The exact circumstances of his death are still debated, but the result was beyond doubt. The Prince of Wales was dead. His severed head was carried to Edward and then sent on to London, where it was crowned with ivy in cruel mockery and set up for public display. With Llywelyn gone, the spirit of the resistance was broken. Dafydd fought on for a few more desperate months, a hunted fugitive moving through the winter mountains as the English net closed around him. He was finally captured in the summer of 1283, betrayed and run down. Edward then made an example of him so brutal that it shocked even hardened contemporaries. Dafydd was dragged through the streets of Shrewsbury, at the tail of a horse and condemned as a traitor. He was hanged until nearly dead, then cut down alive, disemboweled, and finally cut into 4 quarters. His body parts sent to be displayed in cities across the kingdom. He is recorded as the first man of noble rank in recorded history to be executed in this way: hanged, drawn, and quartered. Edward was broadcasting a message that no one in Wales could possibly misunderstand. Defiance of the English crown would now be answered with total and humiliating destruction. The ancient native line of the Princes of Wales was extinguished at a stroke. There would be no more independent Welsh princes. After centuries of stubborn resistance against every invader, the old free Wales was simply gone. The Ring of Iron. Conquering Wales was one thing. Holding it down forever was quite another. And it was here, in the work of permanent occupation, that Edward's genius for cold organization showed itself most clearly. He did not simply win his war and march home in triumph. He built a machine to hold the country down for all time. A machine made of stone and law working together. The stone came first, and on a breathtaking scale. Edward launched one of the greatest castle-building programs in the entire history of Europe. Around the coast and the mountain passes of North Wales, he raised a chain of gigantic fortresses, often called the Ring of Iron. Conwy, Caernarfon, Harlech, and, somewhat later, Beaumaris were the mightiest of them. These were not crude border keeps thrown up in a hurry. They were masterpieces of military architecture, designed by a brilliant engineer brought in from Savoy, a man known as Master James of St. George. They had concentric defenses, walls within walls, so that an attacker who breached the outer ring found himself trapped beneath the inner one. Most crucially, they were positioned on the coast or on tidal rivers, so they could be supplied and reinforced by sea, even if the whole surrounding countryside rose in revolt. A Welsh rebellion could lay siege to these castles, but it could never starve them out. The cost was staggering, swallowing a fortune that strained even Edward's resources. But the strategic result was decisive. The scale of the effort is hard to imagine even now. To build these fortresses, Edward summoned armies of workmen from all across England, thousands of them at the peak of the work. Diggers and quarrymen and masons and carpenters marched to North Wales to labor through the building seasons. Stone, timber, iron, and lead were shipped in by sea and hauled to the sites. Whole new harbors and supply lines had to be organized simply to feed and house the workforce. For years, the conquered coast of Wales became one vast construction site, the largest concentrated building project in medieval Britain. It nearly bankrupted the crown, and some of the castles were never fully completed. But what rose from that effort was a system of fortification so formidable that it locked English control over the country into the very landscape. Fun fact: Caernarfon Castle was built to be far more than a fortress. Its walls were deliberately laid in bands of different colored stone, and its towers were given distinctive, angular, many-sided shapes. Many historians believe this was a conscious imitation of the great land walls of Constantinople, the imperial capital of the Roman East. Edward was making a statement in stone. This was not merely a castle. It was meant to look like the seat of an emperor, a claim that he ruled here not as a conqueror clinging on, but by ancient and imperial right. Caernarfon carried one more layer of meaning. In 1284, while Edward was campaigning in Wales, Eleanor gave birth there, inside the half-built symbol of English conquest, to a son. The boy was named Edward after his father, and he was the future Edward II. Years later, in 1301, his father granted him the title of Prince of Wales, the very title stripped from the dead Llywelyn. From that day to this, the title Prince of Wales has traditionally belonged to the heir to the English, and later the British, throne. It began its life as a trophy of conquest, handed to a baby in a newly conquered land. Alongside the castles came the law, and it was just as deliberate. In 1284, Edward issued the Statute of Rhuddlan, which formally annexed the conquered heartland of Gwynedd to the English crown. Wales was carved up into counties on the English model, with names that survive on the map today: Anglesey, Caernarfonshire, Merionethshire, and Flintshire. English sheriffs and English criminal law were imposed in place of the old Welsh rulers and many of the old Welsh customs, though some local civil traditions were allowed to continue. The conquest was now woven directly into the structure of government itself. The peace was not quite total. In 1294, a fresh and widespread Welsh revolt broke out under a leader named Madog ap Llywelyn, and for a time it threatened to undo everything, even capturing one of the new castles. Edward crushed it with his usual force, and in its aftermath he ordered the building of the last and most perfectly designed of his great fortresses, Beaumaris on Anglesey, a flawless concentric castle that was begun but, in the end, never entirely finished. Here it is worth pausing to picture the world that these enormous castles loomed over. In 13th century Britain, society was sharply and rigidly divided, and where you were born determined almost everything about how you lived. At the very top sat the great lords and bishops. They wore fine wool dyed in deep, expensive reds and blues, trimmed with fur. They ate white bread, spiced meats, and game hunted in their own forests, and they washed it down with wine imported from Gascony, Edward's own French duchy. Below them came the knights and lesser gentry, comfortable enough but careful with their money. The great majority of people, though, were peasants who worked the land. A peasant family ate coarse dark bread of rye or barley. Thick pottage of vegetables and grain simmered all day in a single pot over the fire, cheese, and weak ale, with meat a rare luxury. They wore rough, undyed wool and plain linen, and their lives ran to the rhythm of the seasons and the bells of the church. Much of their labor was owed, week by week, to the Lord on whose land they lived. Into this ancient world, Edward planted brand new walled towns beside his Welsh castles, deliberately settled with English merchants and craftsmen, and closed to the Welsh. They were little islands of English life, dropped into a conquered country and built to make the conquest stick. The expulsion. Now we come to one of the darkest acts of Edward's entire reign, an act that left a permanent stain on his memory. To understand it, we have to talk about money and prejudice together, because in Edward's calculation the two were bound up completely. Jewish communities had lived in England since the time of the Norman conquest, brought over to provide a service that the laws of the church forbade to Christians. Christians were not permitted to lend money at interest, and so Jewish moneylenders filled that essential role, lending to nobles, to merchants, and to the crown itself. This made them economically useful, but also deeply and dangerously resented, especially by the many people who fell into debt to them. And crucially, in the eyes of the law, the Jews were regarded as the personal property of the king. He could tax them, squeeze them, protect them, or abandon them entirely as it suited his interests. Across the 13th century, English kings had taxed the Jewish community so relentlessly and so heavily that, by Edward's time, it had been drained of most of its former wealth. They were no longer the rich resource they had once been. Then, in the late 1270s, came a wave of accusations of coin clipping, the crime of shaving slivers of silver from the edges of coins. Hundreds of people were arrested in the crackdown, a great many of them Jews, and large numbers were executed. In 1275, Edward had already issued the Statute of the Jewry, which banned the Jews from lending money at interest, cutting off the very livelihood that had given them a place in English society. With their economic role destroyed, their wealth exhausted, and their usefulness to the crown spent, they had become, in the king's cold reckoning, expendable. In 1290, Edward issued the Edict of Expulsion. Every Jew in England, men, women, and children, perhaps around 2,000 people in all, was ordered to leave the kingdom by a set deadline that autumn. Their property fell to the crown to dispose of. Some were robbed, cheated, or even killed as they tried to cross the sea to the continent, and many lost everything they had. The date Edward chose to issue the decree fell on a solemn Jewish day of mourning, a detail that many historians read as a deliberate and pointed cruelty. The expulsion served a very practical purpose alongside the prejudice. In return for it, a grateful parliament granted Edward an enormous tax, one of the very largest of the whole medieval period, to fund his costly wars. He wrapped the whole act in the language of religious duty, presenting himself as a pious Christian king cleansing his realm of sin. The bitter truth is that it was both things at once, prejudice and profit, working hand in hand. England's Jewish community would not be permitted to return for more than 350 years. The ban was not lifted until the 1650s, under Oliver Cromwell. It was the first permanent expulsion of its kind by a European state, and it set a grim precedent that other rulers across Europe would follow in the centuries that came after. Whatever else Edward achieved in his long reign, this remains one of the cruelest and most consequential decisions he ever made. The death of a queen. In that same dark year of 1290, a very different kind of blow struck Edward, one that was wholly personal rather than political. His wife, Eleanor of Castile, the partner of nearly his entire adult life, fell seriously ill while traveling with him through the north of England. Eleanor had stood at his side for 36 years. She had crossed Europe with him as a girl, sailed with him to the Holy Land, and followed his endlessly restless court the length and breadth of his kingdoms. She had borne him around 16 children over their marriage, though many of them had died young, as was painfully common even among royalty in that age. In her own lifetime, she had not always been a popular figure. She had a reputation for greedily accumulating land, often by taking over the debts that landowners owed to Jewish moneylenders and then seizing the estates, and the church had openly criticized her for it. But to Edward, whatever the rest of the world thought of her, she was simply irreplaceable. She died in late November 1290, in a village in Nottinghamshire, far from London and far from home. Edward's grief was real, raw, and overwhelming, and he expressed it in a way that has echoed down the centuries. He had her body carried in a long, slow, solemn funeral procession all the way back to Westminster Abbey for burial. And then he did something extraordinary to fix her memory in the landscape of his kingdom forever. At every place where the funeral procession halted to rest for the night on its long journey south, Edward ordered the construction of a tall, richly carved stone cross. There were 12 of them in all, marking the route from Lincoln down to London. They became known as the Eleanor Crosses. They were beautiful and expensive monuments, decorated with statues of the dead queen, and they served both to honor her and to project royal power along the spine of the country. A few of them still survive today, more than 700 years later, and the final stop on that mournful journey gave its name to a place in London that millions of people still pass through every day. Charing Cross takes its name from the last of the Eleanor Crosses, which once stood close to that very spot. For a man so often described as cold, calculating, and harsh, the Eleanor Crosses stand as a striking reminder that Edward was also capable of profound personal attachment. He would marry again some years later, to a French princess named Margaret, and father more children even in his old age. But the loss of Eleanor marked a genuine turning point in his life and his reign. The years that followed would be harder, angrier, and increasingly consumed by the one great conquest that always, somehow, slipped through his fingers: the Great Cause. To understand the long agony of Edward's Scottish wars, we have to turn to a sudden and devastating crisis in the Scottish royal family. For most of Edward's reign, England and Scotland had lived side by side in peace. The Scottish king, Alexander III, was a strong and capable ruler, and broadly friendly toward Edward. But in the 1280s, catastrophe struck the Scottish line again and again. Alexander's children all died before him, leaving him without a direct heir of his own body. Then, in 1286, riding home on a wild and stormy night, Alexander himself was thrown from his horse in the dark and killed. The only direct heir left alive was Alexander's young granddaughter, a little girl living far away in Norway, known to history as Margaret, the Maid of Norway. For a few uncertain years, the Scots tried to hold things together and govern in the child's name through a council of guardians. There was even a hopeful plan, set out in a treaty, for the young Margaret to marry Edward's own son and heir, which would one day have united the two crowns peacefully through marriage, while carefully preserving Scotland's separate laws and independence. For a brief moment, a peaceful future seemed possible. Then, tragedy struck once more. In 1290, the child Margaret died during the rough sea voyage from Norway to Scotland, before she ever reached her kingdom. The ancient royal line of Scotland was now utterly broken. There was no clear heir at all, and Scotland faced the terrifying prospect of having no rightful king. What followed was a genuine constitutional emergency. Suddenly, there were more than a dozen men putting forward claims to the empty Scottish throne, each able to trace some thread of royal blood back through the generations. Only 3 had truly serious claims. All of them descended from the daughters of an earlier Scottish prince. With rival claimants gathering supporters and the country sliding toward civil war, the Scottish leadership made a fateful decision. They invited the most powerful ruler in the region to step in and arbitrate between the competing claims, to judge who had the rightful claim to the crown. They invited Edward. This was precisely the opportunity that Edward had been waiting for, and he seized it without hesitation. He agreed to judge the dispute, which became known as the Great Cause, but he attached a condition that revealed his true and far larger ambition. Before he would settle anything, he insisted that every single claimant first recognize him, not as a friendly neighbor offering help, but as the feudal overlord of all Scotland, the Lord Paramount. He even sent agents to ransack English monastery records, hunting for any ancient precedent for English lordship over the Scots. Fearing that to refuse would mean losing their one chance at the throne, the claimants gave in and acknowledged his overlordship. In that single act of submission, the hard-won independence of the Kingdom of Scotland was quietly and gravely compromised. After lengthy and carefully managed hearings held at Berwick, Edward delivered his judgment in 1292. He chose John Balliol, who genuinely did have the strongest claim by the strict rules of descent. John Balliol was duly crowned King of Scots upon the ancient stone of Scone. But everyone present understood the new reality. Balliol was now Edward's man, a king who held his crown at the pleasure of the King of England, and Edward had absolutely no intention of letting him forget it for a single day. The hammer falls. Edward set about humiliating his new puppet king at every possible turn, and the campaign of humiliation was relentless and deliberate. He treated Scotland not as an allied kingdom, but as a subject territory under his thumb. He insisted on hearing legal appeals from Scottish courts in his own English courts, summoning the King of Scots himself to come south and answer cases in person, as if Balliol were nothing more than another of Edward's barons. And then, when Edward went to war with France over Gascony, he demanded that Scotland supply him with troops and money and military service for a foreign war that was none of Scotland's concern. It was a calculated, grinding effort to strip away whatever dignity and authority the Scottish crown had left. Eventually, the patience of the Scots ran out. The leading men of the realm effectively took control out of the weak and humiliated Balliol's hands, formed a governing council of 12, and made a bold and dangerous move. In 1295, they negotiated a formal alliance with France, Edward's enemy. This was the beginning of what later became famous as the Auld Alliance, the long and durable friendship between Scotland and France against their common foe, England. To Edward, the meaning was simple. This was open rebellion by a vassal, and it had to be crushed. His response, in 1296, was swift, overwhelming, and savage. He marched north at the head of a powerful army and fell upon the prosperous Scottish trading town of Berwick, then one of the wealthiest towns in Scotland. The sack of Berwick was a horror. Edward's soldiers slaughtered a large part of the town's population in a deliberate massacre, an act of calculated terror meant to break Scottish resistance before it had even properly begun. Then, shortly after, at the Battle of Dunbar, the English smashed the Scottish army in open battle. Scottish resistance collapsed entirely. Edward stripped John Balliol of his crown in a ceremony of deliberate public shaming, having the royal arms of Scotland physically torn from the surcoat Balliol wore. From that day, the broken king carried a mocking Scottish nickname, Tomb Tabard, which means the empty coat. Edward then did something heavy with symbolism. He seized the Stone of Scone, the ancient sacred stone upon which the kings of Scots had been enthroned for countless generations, and carried it south to Westminster as plunder. He was, in effect, stealing the very kingship of Scotland and carrying it home. He also made hundreds of Scottish landowners formally swear loyalty to him, their seals recorded on long documents that became known as the Ragman Rolls. Edward now genuinely believed that he had conquered Scotland outright and ended its existence as a separate kingdom. He set up an English administration to govern the country, appointed English officials, and rode back south, fully confident that the matter was closed for good. He was about to discover, exactly as he had once discovered in Wales, that defeating an army in the field is a very different thing from conquering a people in their hearts. Out of the smoking ruins of his conquest, a resistance was about to rise that would haunt and exhaust him for the rest of his life. Fun fact: the Stone of Scone remained in Westminster Abbey, built into the underside of the English coronation chair, for almost exactly 700 years. English, and later British, monarchs were crowned seated directly above it, generation after generation, a permanent and visible symbol of Edward's old claim of supremacy over Scotland. The stone was not finally returned to Scotland until 1996, and even now it travels back to Westminster only on the occasion of a coronation. The King at Bay. Before we follow the Scottish Revolt, we have to understand the desperate corner Edward had backed himself into at home, because for a few months, in 1297, the great conqueror very nearly lost control of his own kingdom. The cause, as so often, was war, and the crushing cost of paying for it. Edward was trying to fight on too many fronts at once. He was at war with the King of France over the Duchy of Gascony, which the French king had brazenly confiscated. He was building his ruinously expensive castles and putting down rebellion in Wales. And now Scotland was stirring as well. All of this demanded staggering amounts of money, and to raise it, Edward pushed his subjects far harder than they were willing to bear. He levied heavy taxes one after another. He seized merchants' wool, the most valuable commodity in England, through a punishing extra duty that people bitterly called the bad tax, and he demanded that his nobles cross the sea to fight for him in Gascony and Flanders, in wars they considered none of their business. The resistance came from two directions at once. The leading earls, headed by the Earl of Norfolk and the Earl of Hereford, flatly refused to serve overseas. There is a famous, possibly embellished exchange in which the king angrily told the Earl of Norfolk that he would either go to Gascony or hang, and the Earl shot back that he would neither go nor hang. At the same time, the church rose against him. The Archbishop of Canterbury, Robert Winchelsea, backed by a new ruling from the Pope, refused to let the clergy be taxed without the Pope's permission. Edward responded with brutal directness, declaring the clergy outside his protection, which meant they could no longer seek justice in his courts, in effect putting them at the mercy of anyone who wished to rob them until they paid up. By the summer of 1297, with Edward about to sail for Flanders, the kingdom was on the edge of a fresh civil war, between the king and a coalition of furious earls, churchmen, and overtaxed subjects. It was the most serious internal challenge of his entire reign. And it was at this exact moment, with Edward abroad and his realm in uproar behind him, that the news arrived from the north. Scotland had exploded into revolt, and an English army had just been destroyed. The double crisis forced Edward to back down at home, at least for the moment, to buy peace and unity. He agreed to a document known as the Confirmation of the Charters, in which he reconfirmed the great liberties of Magna Carta and promised not to levy his heaviest taxes without the consent of the realm. It was a significant retreat for so domineering a king, and it strengthened the principle that even the crown needed consent to tax its people. Edward never fully accepted the limits in his heart, and he spent years afterward trying to wriggle out of them. But the confrontation of 1297 left a real and lasting mark on the relationship between the English crown and its subjects. Wallace and Falkirk. The leader who rose against Edward in the north came from outside the ranks of the great Scottish nobility, which is part of what made him so dangerous and so unexpected. His name was William Wallace, a knight of fairly modest standing from the west of Scotland. In 1297, with much of the Scottish nobility either captured, exiled, bought off, or sitting cautiously on the fence, Wallace and a northern leader named Andrew Moray raised the banner of open revolt in the name of the deposed and imprisoned King Balliol. The two rebel forces joined together to confront an English army at Stirling, the great strategic gateway between the lowlands and the highlands of Scotland. There, on the 11th of September 1297, came the Battle of Stirling Bridge. To reach the Scots, the English army had to cross the River Forth over a narrow wooden bridge, only able to send a few men over at a time. Wallace and Moray watched and waited with iron discipline until a large portion of the English force had crossed, with the rest still backed up helplessly on the far bank. Then they charged. The English who had crossed were cut to pieces, packed against the river with no room to fight and no way to be reinforced across the choked and broken bridge. It was a stunning, humiliating defeat for England, and it transformed William Wallace overnight into a national hero. He was made Guardian of Scotland, ruling the country in the name of the absent Balliol. His ally, Andrew Moray, badly wounded in the fighting, died soon afterward, leaving Wallace to lead alone. Edward was abroad in Flanders when the disastrous news reached him, and he was incandescent with rage. He cut short his foreign affairs, returned to England, and resolved to march north and crush this upstart rebellion in person. In 1298, he assembled a large, superbly equipped army, including a powerful force of archers, and went hunting for Wallace. The two armies met at the Battle of Falkirk in July 1298, and this time the advantages lay firmly with Edward. Wallace drew up his spearmen in great defensive rings called schiltrons, dense and bristling hedgehogs of long spear points that mounted knights simply could not break by charging. It was a sound and disciplined formation, but Edward held the answer in his hands. He brought up his archers, including formidable Welsh and English longbowmen, and poured volley after volley of arrows into the tightly packed Scottish rings. The schiltrons, unable to advance and unable to shelter from the falling arrows, were steadily shredded where they stood. Once the spear rings had been broken open by the archery, the English heavy cavalry charged into the gaps and completed the slaughter. It was a grim demonstration of how the longbow, properly used, could destroy even the most disciplined infantry. Falkirk shattered Wallace's reputation as a war leader. He resigned his guardianship soon after and slipped away into the shadows, becoming a hunted fugitive and outlaw. For years he evaded the English, but his days of commanding armies were finished. Finally, in 1305, he was betrayed and captured, handed over to the English, and taken to London. There he was put on trial as a traitor. Wallace defiantly insisted that he had never once sworn loyalty to Edward, and therefore could not possibly be a traitor to him. but the verdict was a foregone conclusion. He was condemned, and then hanged, drawn, and quartered, his head set upon a pike on London Bridge, and his quartered body sent to be displayed in towns across the north as a warning. Edward intended it as the final, crushing word on Scottish resistance. Instead, he had created a martyr whose name would outlast every castle Edward ever built, and whose legend still burns in Scotland today. A new queen and an aging king. Amid the grinding wars, Edward's own life moved on, and in 1299, almost a decade after losing Eleanor, the aging king married again. The marriage was, like his first, a tool of diplomacy, part of the settlement that finally ended his long and draining war with France. His new bride was Margaret of France, the young sister of the French king. Edward was around 60 years old. Margaret was a teenager, roughly 40 years his junior. By all accounts, despite the enormous gap in their ages, the marriage worked well. Margaret was gentle, dignified, and well-liked, and she even acted at times as a peacemaker, softening some of her formidable husband's harsher impulses and interceding on behalf of those who had angered him. She bore Edward 3 more children in his old age, 2 sons and a daughter, giving the elderly king a fresh young family even as he buried old friends and waged old wars. Margaret never had a separate coronation, and after Edward's death, she famously said that when he died, all men died for her, and never remarried, though she was still a young woman. This is a fitting moment to look at the man himself, the king behind the conquests, because by now his character was fully formed and on full display. Edward was physically imposing, and that mattered enormously in an age that respected strength. He was tall, lean, and powerful, with the long legs that earned him the name Longshanks, a drooping eyelid he inherited from his father, and a speech that was said to carry a slight lisp, which did nothing to lessen the fear he inspired. He had a famously violent temper, and stories survive of him in towering rages, in one of which he is said to have torn out a handful of his own son's hair. He was passionate about hunting and falconry, devoted to the chivalry and pageantry of the tournament, and fascinated by the legends of King Arthur, even reburying what were believed to be Arthur's bones with great ceremony to link his own kingship to that legendary past. He was, at the same time, genuinely pious in the hard fashion of his age, a crusader who never lost his belief that he served God's purposes, even in his cruelest acts. He was a devoted, if domineering, family man. And he was, above everything, relentless. He did not forgive, he did not forget, and he did not let go of a goal once he had fixed on it. All of these qualities, the strength, the temper, the piety, and the iron will, were about to be poured into the last and most personal obsession of his life, the final subjugation of Scotland. Bruce and the last march north. Even after the fall of Wallace, Scotland would not lie still and accept Edward's rule. And now a new and far more dangerous figure stepped forward, a man who had spent years cautiously shifting between the English and Scottish sides, biding his time, waiting for the right moment to make his own bid for the crown. His name was Robert the Bruce. Bruce came from one of the great families that had pressed a claim to the Scottish throne back in the Great Cause. He was ambitious, capable, and utterly ruthless when it counted. In 1306 he finally made his move, but he made it in blood and sacrilege. He arranged to meet his chief rival among the Scots, a powerful noble named John Comyn, in a church in the town of Dumfries. There, before the high altar of the Greyfriars Church, the two men quarreled violently, and Bruce stabbed Comyn down in the sacred space, his followers finishing the killing. It was a shocking act, a murder committed on holy ground, and it should have ruined him in the eyes of the church. But it also cleared his path of his greatest rival in a single stroke. Just a few weeks later, Robert the Bruce had himself crowned King of Scots. Edward, now an old man approaching 70, was consumed with fury at this fresh and outrageous defiance. The conquest he had believed complete a full decade earlier had come apart yet again, and this time, a crowned rival king stood against him. The old king's response was characteristically merciless. His forces fell upon Bruce's small army and scattered it at the Battle of Methven, and Bruce became a hunted fugitive in his own kingdom. Edward hunted down those of Bruce's supporters and family that he could catch and treated them with terrible severity, executing his male allies and imprisoning his women in grim conditions. In one or two cases, reportedly in cages, Edward swore a public and dramatic oath to take vengeance on Bruce and resolved to march north one final time and finish Scotland for good. But Edward was running out of the one thing he could not command, which was time. He had spent his entire life in the saddle, on campaign, driving his body without mercy, and now that body was failing him at last. He was carried north slowly, often too ill to ride, his great strength finally ebbing away. In the early summer of 1307, as he crept toward the Scottish border at the head of yet another army, he could go no further. On the 7th of July, 1307, at a bleak and marshy place called Burgh by Sands, on the coast just short of Scotland, Edward I died. He was 68 years old. He died within sight of the land he had spent his last bitter years trying to conquer, and he died with that conquest still unfinished and slipping away. There is a famous legend about his final wishes. It is said that the dying king commanded that his bones be boiled clean and carried at the head of the English army into Scotland, so that even in death he might lead the conquest, and that his body should not be properly buried until the Scots were finally subdued. Most historians treat this as a dramatic later story rather than sober fact. What is certain is that his son had no intention whatsoever of dragging his father's corpse to war. Edward's body was carried south and buried in Westminster Abbey, beneath a plain, heavy tomb of dark marble, strikingly austere for so great a king. The Hammer's legacy. Edward I left behind a contradiction that historians still argue over fiercely, and that is part of what makes him so endlessly compelling. By almost any measure of medieval kingship, he was one of the most capable rulers England ever produced. He restored the full authority of the crown after the weakness and chaos of his father's reign. He reformed English law so deeply that his statutes shaped the country for centuries and earned him a place among the great lawgivers. He turned Parliament into a permanent institution, even if he only ever meant it as a tool for his own power. He conquered Wales completely and finally, and the castles he built to hold it still stand today among the finest fortresses in the world. And yet his legacy is deeply shadowed, and rightly so. He expelled the entire Jewish community of England in an act of greed and prejudice whose effects lasted for centuries. He governed Wales, Scotland, and Ireland with a harshness that bred lasting bitterness and resentment. And the grand obsession of his final years, the conquest of Scotland, ended in failure. The harder he hammered, the more fiercely the Scots resisted him, until his own death left the work undone. The proof of that failure came almost immediately after he was gone. His son and heir, Edward II, was nothing like his father. Where the first Edward had been disciplined, fearsome, and relentless, the second was distractible, poorly judged, and weak, and he quickly lost his grip on the war and on his nobles alike. Within just 7 years of the old king's death, Robert the Bruce smashed a great English army led by Edward II at the Battle of Bannockburn in 1314, securing Scottish independence on the field of battle in the most decisive way imaginable. The empty coat of John Balliol had been replaced by a real, victorious, and anointed King of Scots. Almost everything Edward I had tried so violently to build north of the border fell apart in his son's hands within a decade. The way later ages remembered him says as much about them as about him. For centuries, English writers celebrated Edward as a model warrior king, the strong ruler who tamed an overmighty nobility, conquered Wales, and gave his country firm laws and a working parliament. To them, he was very nearly the ideal of medieval kingship, but that admiring picture has been steadily complicated. In Scotland and in Wales, he has always been remembered very differently, as a brutal conqueror, the destroyer of nations, the man behind the sack of Berwick, and the head of Llywelyn on display in London. And in the modern era, the expulsion of the Jews and the colonial harshness of his rule over his neighbors have weighed ever more heavily in the balance. He is no longer seen as simply a hero or simply a tyrant. He is seen, more honestly, as both at once, a ruler of extraordinary ability whose talents were turned as readily to cruelty as to good government. That refusal to settle into a simple verdict is exactly why he still fascinates. That cold Latin nickname carved on his tomb, the Hammer of the Scots, was actually added long after his death, probably centuries later, and it was meant entirely as praise. But there is a hard irony buried inside it. A hammer breaks things. It does not build them. Edward could shatter armies, behead princes, depose kings, and carry off sacred stones. What he could never do was make the Scots accept him as their lord. In the end, the man who reshaped England, who erased the ancient independence of Wales, and who rewrote the law of his kingdom, was beaten by the one nation he wanted most of all. He remains one of the towering and most divisive figures of the entire English Middle Ages, admired and feared in his own lifetime, and argued over ever since. If this story gave you a clearer picture of one of England's most formidable and most complicated kings, do one thing for me. Subscribe to the channel. There is a whole world of medieval history we are working our way through here, and I would genuinely like to have you along for the rest of it. If you made it all the way to the end of this one, you now know more about Edward I than almost anyone you are ever likely to meet. There is another video waiting on screen right now. That one is next. If this was worth an hour and a half of your time, a single like tells me to keep making them. Thanks for watching.